Welcome to CityWorks, a production of the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. I'm Laura Flanders. Each month, CityWorks explores the lives of working people on the job, at home, and in our communities to explore ways to better advance an agenda of social and economic equality. On this special edition of CityWorks, highlights from a labor conference held at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. The all-day conference, How Workers Win, Rebuilding Labor's Power for the 21st Century, explored new developments in the labor movement, from recent organizing efforts to bargaining and strikes to political campaigns outside the workplace that have also expanded workers' power. We begin with organizing, specifically what meaningful organizing looks like or can look like today and into the future. In this segment from the conference, we'll hear Eric Blanc, Rutgers assistant professor, talking about worker-to-worker organizing, or DIY unionism, and Rutgers University assistant professor Tamara on Amazon workers in predominantly Black communities who are organizing to push back against that company's racialized employment practices.
So what is do-it-yourself unionism? I'm talking about strikes and union drives that are initiated by self-organized workers and/or in which workers take on key responsibilities traditionally reserved for union staff. If you pick up almost any book on workplace organizing, any handbook written in the last 30, 40 years, it's going to tell you should build a strong organizing committee tasked with reaching out to your coworkers. And Kate Brofenbrenner's really amazing quantitative research has confirmed over and over again that these type of intensive rank-and-file tactics are central to winning union drives. A minority of national unions and locals have consistently sought to implement these methods, but, and this is the crucial point, the vast majority of union drives for decades have not implemented best organizing practices. And this point has been sadly reconfirmed by Kate's research, which has found that only about 20 to 30% of drives since the late 80s have even had active and representative organizing committees. So unlike most unions, DIY drives have relied on a wide range of rank-and-file organizing methods, and my survey data shows that over 90%, for instance, have had active and representative OCs. And indeed, many DIY unionists I've interviewed explicitly frame their efforts as upholding a long-standing left-leaning rank-and-file oriented organizing tradition, as exemplified, for instance, in the writings of Jane McAlevey and Labor Notes. So rather than counterposing momentum organizing to structure-based organizing, recent experience suggests that the former can be a crucial mechanism to boosting the latter. What then are the particular strengths of DIY unionism? The first is that young radicalized workers are generally pushing for a strategy that is better calibrated for our anti-union neoliberal context than most traditional union strategies of looking for high road companies or trying to lobby Congress into passing a national labor law reform. Experience shows that you make companies high road by forcing them to go onto a high road, and that it's unlikely you're going to get major labor law reform on a national level without significant upsurge in mass struggle from below. Another strength of relying on worker-to-worker organizing is that it helps undercut bosses' ongoing attempts to portray the union as a third party standing between management and workers. And there are real drawbacks, which I'll talk at the end about this approach. Increased worker leadership also does tend to foster a culture of democratic unionism. To conclude, actually, my big takeaway then is that the growth of DIY unionism shows why labor as a whole should immediately make a major turn towards new organizing. Both traditional and DIY methods are going to be necessary, but only DIY unionism has the potential to win at scale. And there's no guarantee that this turn to new organizing will succeed, but at a minimum, it would likely win material concessions, increase pressure on state officials to pass labor law reform or to implement current labor law, train thousands of new worker leaders, and accumulate invaluable lessons on what it will take to win big. Thank you. I think the panel did a good job of laying out some of the different strategies that labor is engaging with. And there's good work being done. I came away from this still feeling like there's a moment that's being missed. Are we willing to take more risks right now? Are we willing to let workers take more initiative and control over the unionization drives? And these are really big questions that are linked to youth radicalization, and some of the older generations might be a little bit disconnected from this organizing. one of the crucial issues is breaking from this deference to the Democratic Party. I do think we need state actions, we need good politicians on the right side, but this sort of old-standing lobbying behind the scenes hope that they do the right thing is just not going to meet the moment. You know, we've seen that Biden hasn't really taken a real stand in support of Amazon workers and Starbucks. It's more words than deeds. And so there's going to have to be a really different approach, willing to actually challenge some of the Democratic Party leaders if we expect them to change their behavior. Young radicalized workers are using the NLRB process much more than traditional unions. And the norm up until recently is that you're not going to be able to win against big corporations through the NLRB process. So most unions have actually avoided trying to go to elections at companies like Amazon or Starbucks. And so it's taken younger workers to try to actually revive and revitalize this process through the NLRB. And they're fortunate that there is the best NLRB we've had since 1938 in place right now. And it shows the potential for good state actors working to support unionization with militant bottom-up action to bring a whole new type of dynamic into play.
We're going to take a slightly different tack to this question of what's new or new worker organizing. And I want to tell you a little bit about the Origin Project. We're currently involved in a nationwide study of Amazon's practice of policing, which includes using off-duty police officers at its facilities nationwide. And the way that this came to me is that through Jobs with Justice, the RWDSU, the union in Bessemer, Alabama, right, reached out looking for some scholars who could actually bring a critical race and intersectional lens to what's going on in Amazon's practices. Some of the stories you've heard already. We know a lot about surveillance and the kind of technology Amazon has. But the question here, which started in Bessemer, is like when your facility is over 80% Black, how do those practices go even deeper? How much more intense is it? So then when we think about worker responses to it, and when we think about what's a victory, and we think about whether or not it's new, we have to go deeper, right? And try to understand why are workers responding this way? What are workers really wanting? We have an academic paper that's under review. For those of you who are really into the academic stuff, we are fine sharing a draft with you, but what we really want to do with this 15 minutes is bring the workers in the room. I think a lot of times we talk about workers, we talk about race, we talk about Black people, but when you bring them in the room, you also have to deal not only with race, but with racism, right? You could hear it in their voices. So we're gonna try to bring them literally into the room with some audio, and hopefully that moves you in some way. But what did we find when we had the very narrow research question of Amazon's relationship with police and how they were using them during Bessemer? We found when we looked at the quantitative data from the public record searches that even though Amazon engages police, off-duty police across the nation, they are much more likely to use police in the Southern Black Belt, right? It's really important to understand that. Police are not great to be using during organizing campaigns ever, but when you are specifically in the Southern Black Belt, then we gotta look more deeply at why they're doing that. So I wanted to, again, I talked a lot about the workers. We wanna bring, if we can get this audio played, we put the script up there for those of you who can benefit from that in terms of accessibility. And what you're gonna hear here, one second, is our interview with one Black worker, middle-aged Black man, talking about how he felt in that environment with a very young white supervisor talking to him in a way. Well, let me let him tell you himself.
I know I had since you said that, I know I had an incident with a PA. And I felt like it was racist because she told me, I went back to her and told her, my machine was down, and it was broke, and they need to fix it. And so by the time someone came over there and fixed it, she told me to log off my machine, and she told me to go to stand up so she could put me on another machine. So by the time she told me that, the guy fixed the machine. So I asked her, can I just stay at my machine now since they already fixed it? She said, no, just go do what I told you to do.
Wow. In that tone.
In that tone, and that made me feel, I'm going to tell you exactly the way it made me feel.
Let me tell me.
Like, Negro, get back to that machine like I told you. That's,
right.
Oh my God. And then when I thought that, it was another female walking beside me. And I thought, I looked at her, then I looked back at her, and I kept walking, and something told me, no. So I backed back and let her caught up with me. Mm-hmm. And I said, I ain't know her name. I said, what you just told me, how you just came at me, I took that racist and I ain't like that. Mm-hmm. She said, well, if you took it like that, I didn't mean to say it like that. I said, how you meant it? Mm-hmm. Because when you told me, and I told her exactly how I felt, I said, I felt like you just told me, get back at that station.
Yeah.
Do what I told you to do.
Right.
Okay. So those of us who are Black folks in the room recognize tone policing like that, right? The reason why I wanted to show or play that clip is that it shows simultaneously this racialized practices that Amazon does, but it also shows the power of talking back to a white person in the South, right, about the way they're talking to you. This image I put up here because there were literally hundreds of workers who had similar signs. This is in Bessemer. This was part of their union campaign. But they asked everyone to write why they are voting yes for a union. And I want you to understand that it's almost never wages, hours, working conditions. Of course, they complain about those things, but this is about dignity and humanity and democracy. On those signs you see, I don't want to feel like a slave on a corporate plantation. Slavery is over, give us what we deserve. So again, if we're talking about, and Sarita's in the audience, and I love that because we talk, when we say what's new about organizing, we're talking about whole worker organizing. And so this is about not just workplace democracy in the workplace at the enterprise level, but it's also about dignity, humanity, democracy at large.
The CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies is the 25th and newest school under the CUNY umbrella. Dedicated to public service and social justice, the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies offers undergraduate and graduate degrees in the areas of labor studies and urban studies, and certificate programs in labor relations, public administration and public policy, healthcare policy and administration, and community leadership. We pride ourselves on being an institution that brings together activists and academics. Find out more at slu.cuny.edu.
You're watching CityWorks. I'm Laura Flanders with highlights from a recent conference at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies on rebuilding labor's power in the United States. In this segment, we'll hear Sarita Gupta, Vice President of U.S. Programs at the Ford Foundation, on placing race and gender front and center in the labor movement, and from Ben Wilkins, Director of the Union of Southern Service Workers, on the unique challenges of organizing in the South.
So the Union of Southern Service Workers was founded in November of last year in Columbia, South Carolina. We chose Columbia for a specific reason. Number one, it's where we have an incredible group of worker activists. But number two, because South Carolina is the lowest union density state in the country. And I think that really informs the way that we've organized. And the union emerges out of 10 years of organizing through Raise Up the South, as we were formerly called, which is part of the Fight for 15 in a Union movement. And last night, Mark from UE, who I don't know if he's in here, but he said, you know, the great historic challenge of labor is to organize the South. And that's the challenge that we're trying to confront. So the barriers to organizing, what are Southern workers up against? I think it's pretty clear. I think most folks generally have a sense what Southern workers are facing, but I think it's worth stating. So there's really three things. One is the total opposition of the state to the union, the total opposition of the state. Anti-union electeds hold supermajorities in pretty much every Southern state legislature. They did not in North Carolina, where I live, until a few weeks ago, and now they do. And in South Carolina, they do, and I actually am not a political person, so I can't tick off every state legislature, but in pretty much all of them. And that's a historic phenomenon, you know, obviously going back to the founding of this country and the role of slaveholders in constituting political power in this country. But to be more modern about it, going back to the post-war period when right-to-work laws were passed and really Southern legislators were at the forefront of that drive. And so large swaths of Southern workers have been excluded from trade union legality, from union rights. Especially in the industries that we're organizing, especially low-wage workers, especially black workers. So that's barrier number one. Number two, and this is really obvious, but I think it's kind of important to state, is union density is really, really low. There are very few workers who are in a union. In South Carolina, it's 1.7%. The labor movement in South Carolina is incredible, but very small. It's basically the dock workers, a couple steel workers locals. I think UPS might have a local. There's like a very small labor movement in the South. And then the third thing is not unique to the South, but bears mentioning too. It's the way that work is organized in the low-wage service sector. In places like fast food, dollar stores, gas stations, home health care, the industries are really built intentionally on a high turnover model. They don't want workers to stay in the job for very long. And so basically what they do is employers across the board recruit from a very large pool of low-wage labor, available labor. Workers shift from jobs to job. Turnover in fast food is about 150% every year. Folks may have 4, 5, 6 jobs in the course of a year and may hold 3 jobs at any one time. So organizing in a traditional way, unit by unit, worksite by worksite, in a dollar store when there's 3 workers there is not a way to build power, in my opinion. All right, so how do we organize? So our union is really organized to address these challenges. First rule of how we define a union is that we don't let the boss define it for us. We simply define it as a group of workers coming together to build power, to make things better. That's what a union is. That's what we're building. And centrally what we're doing is organizing the low-wage service labor pool across geographies, places like Columbia, South Carolina, Durham, North Carolina, and organizing workers to confront the power of employers across the spectrum. So folks have probably heard of the Highlander Center, the Highlander Folk School. There's a tradition of popular education in the South, specifically in the workers' movement in the South. And we seize on that tradition and make it central to the work that we do. We define popular education as a participatory process using workers' own experiences to analyze the world and create strategies for change. So to this end, everything we do is popular education. Every organizing conversation, every social media post, follow us on TikTok, follow us on Instagram. We're constantly engaging in pedagogical processes to build the protagonism of Southern workers. I think democracy is about more than voting. It's about protagonism. It's about workers being a part of the decision-making that impacts their lives. And really, at the end of the day, that's the only thing that can build power for workers. And that's what the Union of Southern Service Workers is all about. And I'm looking forward to talking to everybody about it more. Thanks. I'm 40 years old, so I've been organizing in one way or another in the movement, since I was about 18, so 22 years, and I cannot remember a time quite like this. And I think we're in a unique moment, and it's very important that we all kind of seize on the moment because you never know how long it's going to last, and just to push as hard as we can. And it's just an incredible collection of people who are doing incredible work on all these different fronts. And so I think one of the beautiful things about the movement that's emerging right now is there's so many different fronts of struggle. There's all kind, Starbucks, Amazon, CWA, the work that we're trying to do. It's popping off on so many different levels that I think is just really exciting, but it's also gives me a great sense of responsibility for the work that we're doing in this moment specifically. I have always found that folks in the North, especially trade union activists in the North, get it. I mean, I think it's generally understood that there's a critical importance of organizing in the South. I think the hard part is figuring out how to do it. And you're right, there's very few union members in the South, especially places like South Carolina. But what there are is there's a lot of really fired up workers. And that's really what I take heart in. And on some level, you know, the fact that there's this open terrain and that there's really no previously existing unions, or very few anyways, creates an opportunity to really imagine a new possibility for what a union movement could look like. The number one thing that we try to do is build a culture of struggle and a culture of fearlessness in the way that we organize. And the second thing I'd say is that, to be honest, and I'm specifically talking about people who are working for $10 an hour jobs and, you know, Wendy's, McDonald's, Dollar General, all these places, there's not a ton to lose, especially in the labor market that we have right now. I mean, it is pretty common, honestly, for folks to get fired, whether for organizing or for a whole lot of other reasons. But the conditions are so despairing and so bad that I think there's a real militancy and a readiness to fight, specifically on the part of low-wage workers.
So my talk today is based on the book that I co-authored with Erica Smiley, who is the executive director of Jobs with Justice, titled The Future We Need, Building a Better Democracy in the 21st Century. And yes, I'm with the Ford Foundation, but actually Smiley and I wrote this book as part of our leadership transition. I was the former director of Jobs with Justice and worked with Jobs with Justice for many years. And we wrote this book really to document some of the innovations that we're seeing in approaches to collective bargaining across the workers' rights field, as we supported and partnered with many unions, worker centers, and other organizing groups. There are three main points that we make in the book that I think are really critical to inform new approaches to building worker power and collective bargaining. The first is that collective bargaining must be expanded beyond workplaces to support a healthy political and economic multiracial democracy. The second is that collective bargaining needs to be modernized to meet the needs of today's workers. And thirdly, we must center race and gender in the worker movement because workers have complex intersectional identities, and that is the only way we can win progress. I think these were points made earlier by Tammy, and is it Maite? Maite, thank you for the call out on the book and for what you raised on the first panel. All of this, of course, is extremely relevant given the uptick of workers organizing and taking collective action today. So I'm going to just go deep on some of these points. So democracy is about the ability for people to govern over aspects of their lives. Democracy is not just a system of political practices. Democratic principles must also be applied to the participation and decision-making in all aspects of our economic lives. While voting and lobbying and other forms of policy and legal work are important forms of democratic participation, collective bargaining, both at work and elsewhere, applies democratic practices to economic relationships. Without both political and economic democracy, the whole system is compromised. So collective bargaining is fundamental to democracy. Business, finance, and the economy have transformed over the last century, all of which has eroded workers' rights and our public institutions. We need to forge new ways of organizing and bargaining appropriate to a world in which power is concentrating in the hands of fewer economic actors. So at its best, collective bargaining is a system by which working people can exercise collective power in a way that directly confronts the owners of capital and reclaims a portion of that capital for working people in their communities. Collective bargaining allows everyday people to practice democracy, directly engaging in the decisions that affect their lives. And workers have a stake in their ability to come together collectively, not only as employees, but also in the myriad of other ways working people interact in the economy as tenants, debtors, homeowners, and consumers. So one example of this is the Crown Heights Tenants Union, which consists of tenants residing in a number of buildings in Brooklyn who have joined together to negotiate with corporate landlords. To get corporate landlords to negotiate, they're prepared to carry out a rent strike. The ultimate goal is not only to sign collective bargaining agreements, but also to use such agreements in the fight against neighborhood gentrification, displacement, and other attacks on affordable housing. In 2021, Amazon workers in Bessemer, Alabama, mostly Black, called for help in their bid to form a union with RWDSU, as we heard on the panel earlier. Many workers shared how radicalized they were after the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota by former police officers. After having participated in the 2020 summer uprisings for racial justice, it gave them the courage to speak out about their own conditions during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we heard, their union election is still too close to call. During that same week, as we all know very well, the Amazon Labor Union was also able to win their union. And that was also because people were radicalized by racial injustice after Chris Smalls and others were arrested and fired in the early days of the pandemic for demanding better COVID protections. You contrast these victories with the setbacks experienced by two unions in 2017 after attempting to win union elections without centering race. Both the UAW's attempts to organize workers at the predominantly Black Nissan facility in Canton, Mississippi, and the machinists' union's attempt to organize workers at Boeing's Charleston, South Carolina facility did little to emphasize how both companies recognized their unions when workers formed in other locations that were not majority Black, focusing instead on traditional issues of wages and corporate greed. And in both cases, we lost, and it wasn't close. Workers active in today's struggle are winning because they center race and gender, and the experiences of exploitation they've experienced because of it. That is why workers are activated and why we're making progress.
How Workers Win, Rebuilding Labor's Power for the 21st Century, a conference this past spring at CUNY SLU. More from the conference shortly. We just heard from Sarita Gupta. She and Erica Smiley, longtime organizer and movement leader, have co-authored a book, The Future We Need, Organizing for a Better Democracy in the 21st Century. Here from a recent edition of CityWorks, Smiley discusses why new tactics and new approaches to labor and political organizing are necessary. One of the other things you have in the book is a new map for how to think about these things. I mean, one of the arguments that I hear very strongly through the book and from what you've said is that we need to change where we are putting our expectations about who our leadership is, what the critical issues are, and where this organizing can take place. And in particular, you say there has to be a centering of race and gender, or of people of color and women, if we want to win. Mm-hmm. So can you just talk a little bit about what's different there from what we normally hear? Well, we need to include people. And that map of yours, Smiley, I understand it was your map.
It was something, well, look, let me put it this way, right? I mean, being from North Carolina, I was sick of being red all the time and having that not taken to account the history and the movement and the power that came from the people I grew up around. And so, yeah, I mean, look, this is one of those things where it's not simply about inclusion. I think this is really a really important point. It's actually about building and perhaps seeing in the future, building a democracy that we can all see ourselves in, a very different framework than what we've been given. And that it's not so much that what we accomplished before through the New Deal and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act was wrong. They were really good experiments. We've now seen many of their limitations, and it's time to expand on them so that we can apply a framework that allows everyone to participate in decision making. And so this map is very straightforward. It actually is just a question of what's the relationship between any given state or county and 20th century forms of democracy, including can they still vote and elect people based on popular support, majority opinion, and can they form and organize unions and negotiate in their workplaces in ways that are based on majority opinion. And what we saw is that in places that had long lost, if they ever had access to 20th century mechanisms of democracy, economic or political, like the Atlanta washerwomen, that in some of these places, working people today had far more appetite for building something new. They weren't just mad about what had been lost. They weren't just feeling left behind by recent institutions and administrations, they actually had an imagination for a 21st century democracy that we could perhaps all get behind. And so I think that's important because, you asked earlier about some of the stories in the book that we really like. Another one really is like the West Virginia teachers. And the idea that gave me, or the thing that gave me the idea for this new map, it originally showed up in an article on the JOJ website called Teachers Map the Path to Power. And it was because the three counties that first walked out in those historic teacher actions in 2018 that we were all moved and motivated by were Mingo, Wyoming, and I should, you would think I would learn the third one by now. I always forget the third one, and they should totally chastise me about it. But there were the three counties at the bottom, and you would think because they were the first ones who took courageous action that they were like the left vanguard of the state. But in fact, when you looked at a political map, they were like in some of the most conservative areas of the state, like embedded, like in there, ride or die.
And how do you explain that?
Yeah, and how we explain it is very straightforward. In fact, like many of the folks here have a relationship and a history to a movement past. Many of them are the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people who fought for dignity in the Battle of Blair Mountain. And like their interests were very aligned with many of us who would consider ourselves progressives or even left. They were very clear on dignity, respect, this need of taking care of each other. In fact, the teachers would sometimes, one of the teachers told me, who's in the book, actually told me the story of how her husband worked as a medical technician and like would make sure that he texted her and other teachers every morning if one of the students had a parent or older sibling who had OD'd or who had a problem, so that they could adjust and ensure that that student was taken care of and had wraparound services. That's what community looks like. That's what collectivity looks like. Right. And if you see those values don't always show up in a political map, but those values drive people to act in ways that we might underestimate. And so as organizers, if we aren't looking for that, if we're just looking at the political map, if we're just thinking about the muddy middle and the soccer moms and whatever the pollsters tell us, we'll actually miss the opportunity to see people take real courageous action. And Laura, just one other thing here, because you asked about race and gender, I want to be really clear. Like, again, it's not simply about inclusion, because we don't want to be included at a broken table. We sometimes want a new table, right? And I think many working class white workers, right, have the same reaction. They want a new table. And so what's really exciting about the yellow states on that map and where many workers are in motion, including workers at Amazon, workers in my home state of North Carolina, just voted at Starbucks in Boone to form a union. There's a new Amazon committee in Durham, right? So like there's a lot of momentum happening even outside of the traditional locations. And I think it's critical because what it actually shows us is that not only do these workers have a new appetite, but the thing that's motivating them, right? If you listen to some of the interviews of Big Mike from Bessemer, if you listen to some of the interviews of Chris Smalls and other workers in Staten Island, you automatically see that many of the workers saw their fight on the shop floor as their movement for Black lives. The fact that they were over surveilled by police, being a majority Black work site, that was their movement for Black lives. And that was the motivating thing that got people in motion to fight and ultimately, in some instances, to win.
You're watching CityWorks. I'm Laura Flanders with highlights from How Workers Win, Rebuilding Labor's Power for the 21st Century, a conference held at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. Coming up, University of California, San Francisco law professor Veena Dubal explores how on-demand delivery and ride-hailing companies like Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash exploit their workers through an unfair wage system based on extremely complicated algorithms. First, Kavitha Iyengar, Vice President with UAW Local 2865, representing college student workers in California on a potent new wave of organizing and strikes in higher education and a surge in union membership.
So my paper and my talk today is about the UAW's interventions in organizing academic student employees and charts how the union's strategies have helped to increase the representational density in the higher education sector. What Eric talked about is this new wave that's happening in higher ed organizing. I argued that the UAW's efforts to transform academic student employee organizing and labor law in higher education was achieved via systematic industrial approaches to new organizing and striking. So, for those who are familiar with organizing academic student employees, there have been recognized unions in the sector since the late 1960s. During the first phase of unionization, you can call it what you want, but from the 60s to the 90s, the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT, was the primary major union in the sector, and organized the majority of the unions that became recognized. These were mostly public sector teaching assistants. These included unions at the University of Wisconsin, CUNY right here, Rutgers, University of Michigan, Oregon, Florida, lots of schools in Florida, New York, Kansas, lots of states, but public sector, right? So no academic student employees in the private sector were recognized, and they were suffering under legal decisions by the National Labor Relations Board that had denied student employees the right to organize in order to assess a graduate student assistant's employment status, rather than just applying a common law test for what's an employee. That's what happens for every other represented employee in the country. The board assessed what the graduate students were doing and said that you had to balance a student employee's services performed for their employer against the learning objectives and their educational relationship. And looking at these students' research apprenticeships, the board found that this relationship was educational, not one of an employee to an employer. In 2000, graduate student workers at New York University broke through the first problem, winning recognition of the private sector group of graduate assistants in the country. First time. They won their election, bargained their first contract. The board found that there was none of this dual relationship to preclude being an employee. However, when graduate students workers at Brown filed a petition in 2004, the board overturns that decision, decides that private sector graduate students were again not employees. Subsequently, NYU refused to bargain and negotiate an agreement with NYU, right? And so heeding this decision, the NYU graduate students file a petition to overturn Brown. Then NLRB agrees to review it, and in response to organizing pressure, a strike threat, and political pressure, NYU agrees to a neutrality agreement, re-recognizes the union, and the union withdraws its petition. What the key lesson is from all of this, from this changing legal regime, from this uncertainty in whether people are employees or not, is that it took majority support at each of these workplaces, worker-led committees, having representative groups of workers in every department who are having people engaged in the fight to have a union, and having real strikes, big strikes, to demand having a union and having rights. That's all that there is in this shifting legal regime, and it's very important to remember that that's the strategy that took 20 years to put in place. And it's led to this huge outgrowth today of all these private sector unions in the country demanding recognition, which is very exciting and will lead to the higher density that will allow workers in the industry to actually have a say.
I had lots of roles in the UAW at the University of California for years. I served on the union's executive board. I was president for the union. I led negotiations at the bargaining table during the strike. And I've never been part of a moment with so much power. When I think about the workers who voted to have a strike and to act in sympathy with each other, to win a union and to win these contracts, to really change higher education, I get really emotional, because that's the type of power we need for this new labor movement, is people taking solidaristic action together at scale, and that's what thousands of workers at the University of California did. We're in the middle of this huge wave of higher education organizing right now. A lot of workers at different universities have announced that they're forming unions or winning elections, and now are set to bargain their first contracts. At the University of Southern California, I've seen firsthand that the university and the workers are both responding. The workers are responding by getting ready to fight for their first contract, and the university is responding by improving working conditions before we can even get the first contract. As we get more activity and more worker organization in the sector. There's a race to the top happening with the employers, and that's really exciting too, to see that we can change working conditions and get workers organizing all across the industry. And so it's more private sector unions, universities have filed for elections in the last year than had filed in the last 2 decades.
One of the biggest battles that labor will be waging in politics in the coming decades is not just over the introduction of invasive and exacting technologies that we've heard about today, but more specifically over how these technologies will be used together with the law to limit compensable time and lower wages. In both California and Washington state, laws have been passed preventing millions of workers laboring for on-demand transportation and delivery companies like Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and Instacart from laying claim to minimum wage and overtime laws. In Washington state and California, these workers, on-demand delivery and ride-hail drivers, that the vast majority of whom are racial minorities and immigrants, are subject by law to a practice that I have called algorithmic wage discrimination. So by this wonky term, algorithmic wage discrimination, I mean to refer to a wage setting practice in which individual workers are paid different hourly wages, calculated with ever-changing formulas, using granular data on location, individual behavior, demand, supply, and other unknown factors for broadly similar work. And as a wage-setting technique, algorithmic wage discrimination encompasses not only digitalized payment for work completed, but critically, digitalized decisions to allocate work. An example from one driver in my research is as follows. There was a night at the end of one week. It felt like the algorithm was punishing me. I had 95 out of 96 rides for a $100 bonus. It was 10 o'clock at night in a popular area. It took me 45 minutes in a popular area to get that last ride. The algorithm was moving past me to get drivers who weren't closer to their bonus. I was putting the work in the way I was supposed to, but the app was punishing me because it was cheaper to give the ride to someone else. So I got 45 minutes of dead time because they were hoping I would give up. It is this unpaid waiting time in between jobs that is critical to the on-demand business model as it currently exists across service and logistics sectors. This unpaid time, which is the primary way in which on-demand firms practice algorithmic wage discrimination, has also been the central site of a behind-the-scenes political battle as labor unions attempt to solve the precarities of on-demand work through legislation. I'll end by sharing ways that organizing on-demand workers have been thinking about algorithmic wage discrimination and trying to organize it against it. And I might say that because these workers, all of whom are self-organizing, actually do the work every day and really deeply understand it, that we should think very critically about these tools, or we should look at the tools very closely. So groups like Rideshare Drivers United here in New York State, the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, and the app-based Drivers and Couriers Union in the UK have frequently demanded the traditional wage floor associated with employment status. New York City, you may know, is the one place in the entire country where this has been accomplished legislatively, but recognizing that this would not solve all the harms that arise from their digitalized variable pay, which can and do in some contexts exist alongside a minimum wage floor, these groups have more recently turned their attention to the data and algorithms that are invisible to them. In this sense, they are organizing not just for a return to the Fordist employment system, but rather attempting to redefine the terms of work in relationship to informational capitalism and its indeterminate futures. So as a first step, using existing and emergent data privacy laws, these workers have sought to make transparent both the data and algorithms that determine their pay, including those that determine work allocation. In the EU, the ADCU has accomplished just that. This is really an amazing group of self-organizing drivers. A few weeks ago, after years of litigation against Uber, an appellate court found that under GDPR, the drivers are entitled to knowledge about the algorithms that determine their pay. I expect that this will be contested in a higher court. And although I think it's an amazing first step, I want to argue that transparency will not stop this practice. So I maintain, in conclusion, that rather than negotiating with these companies in the political arena and experimenting with sectoral bargaining laws that legalize the practice of algorithmic wage discrimination, as both the California and Washington state laws do, we need to organize against and legislate for an affirmative legal prohibition against this new practice altogether. Thank you.
This past June, New York City introduced a minimum wage for app-based delivery workers, a remarkable shift in how popular platforms like Uber, Grubhub, and DoorDash pay their gig workers. The new law comes after a multi-year organizing and lobbying campaign by Los Deliveristas Unidos, a collective of some 15,000 New York app delivery workers. We spoke recently with the Deliveristas about delivery work in New York City, the workers themselves, and organizing for better pay and working conditions here. Here's some of what we learned. Josh, introduce us, kind of virtually speaking, to some of your colleagues. I mean, you are almost a stereotypic deliverista. You're young, fit, you started at 18. Are you in fact typical? Are all the deliveristas people like you?
Definitely not. I mean, there's a small segment of young people who needed a job. Most deliveristas are immigrants. I can't speak on behalf of anyone whose experience is not my own, but.
And you know anyone that's got hurt?
It's common. We all get involved in accidents. The reason that our labor is even valued at all is because we can transport something from point A to point B quickly in dense traffic. The way that you do that is you be a little bit more mobile, a little bit smaller than everybody else on the road. Whatever vehicle you're on, that makes you more vulnerable. If there's ever a disagreement about who has right of way between you and a car, you're the one getting hurt.
And your income is dependent on how many deliveries you make, is that right?
Yes.
So there's an impetus to go as quickly as you can.
Yeah, we're getting paid by the job.
Why organize? Why did you choose to organize? Because you've got enough on your plate, and that's just adding a whole other thing to do.
We're stronger together. Organizing is really the only option that we have. We are the industrial reserve pool of labor. This is something that they're putting out the task of, is anyone willing to do this order? They'll start at the lowest bidder, $2, $3, $4, see if anyone takes it. We know that that isn't sustainable. Problem is, there's people who are desperate enough that they need to take those orders, and they'll do it for $2, $3, $4. The only way to stop that from happening is if all of us come together and say, no, you can't get away with this anymore. Our goal is to turn this into a dignified profession. That means that we have to have a union. We have to be able to bargain directly with these companies and say that these are the standards that you are going to have to hold us to if we're willing to do your work.
And that's exactly what the Workers' Justice Project has been about, right? Lihia, can you talk about this organizing drive, effort, what it's taken, what your demands have been, and then we'll hear some of the good news about what you've won.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what Josh said. There is no other choice to make and win basic labor protections, and why not secure worker representation in your job? And deliveristas actually they organize in one of the worst crises of our nation in the middle of a pandemic out of necessity and because there was no other choice. And deliveristas, when they started to organize, one of the most beautiful and powerful things is that these are strong worker leaders who already have been organizing out of necessity as a way of survival. We started organizing by bringing all these different networks that deliveristas have been building to stay safe in the streets. And what it took literally the courage of workers to say, enough is enough.
And just forgive me, but there's not a union hall. It's like, how do you connect and to organize?
Right. Even though deliveristas are not unions, they already operate as a union.
Talk about that.
They are building what we call networks in WhatsApp groups and Telegrams, in Facebook groups, where they are already bonding together, organizing together to make sure that they don't take the cheapest deliveries, to make sure that when somebody gets in an accident, they aid that other worker right away. They've been meeting to push the companies actually to define what the demands when it comes to legislation would be. They're the ones who literally are pushing back to the companies to say, no, you have to treat us better, you have to pay us better, and we deserve better as essential workers in New York City. And they're building one of the largest, fastest organizing networks in the country, which now it's called Los Deliveristas Unidos. And it's one of the not only the largest, but more diverse organizing collectives, that it's not only made of Latino, but also we're talking about African deliveristas, South Asian deliveristas, specifically the Bangladeshi, which is a large workforce in the industry. At the end of the day, they realize, as Josh said, they're stronger when they're united, and they understand that they're not going to be able to confront the power of these app delivery companies if they don't unionize and if they don't organize.
You're watching CityWorks. A labor conference held this past spring in New York City brought together labor leaders, organizers, and scholars to discuss new developments in the labor movement. We'll wrap up with conference presenter Bob Master, who until recently was political director of Communication Workers of America, District 1. Bob Master calls the strike labor's most powerful weapon.
I want to begin with a few opening remarks, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to stipulate that we don't really have to debate that strikes are good for workers and good for the labor movement, and that the staggering decline in strikes since 1981 is both a major symptom and an important cause of the decline of the labor movement. When we don't strike, we don't win. The other thing I do want to say before delving into the question of what it will take to revive the strike is that strikes are at least as important to the internal vibrancy and effectiveness of a union as they are an effective weapon against the boss. The strike is the only activity undertaken by a union in which the leadership, the entire organization, must know exactly where every single member stands. You are either on the picket line or you're a scab. No legislative campaign, no political campaign, no contract campaign without a strike requires the union to be systematically in touch with every single member. Likewise, the strike requires every worker to make a choice. I'm with the union or I'm with the boss. I'm on the side of the workers or I'm on the side of corporate power. So unions that do strike on a regular basis are healthier, more participatory, more democratic organizations. I think it's useful, as Carlos did, to kind of look at the experience of our own unions, of the CWA, which I was fortunate enough to work for over the last 36 years and continue to strike all through this post-Patco period, and ask ourselves, or I want to ask, what was the combination of cultural, political, industrial, historical factors that made it possible for CWA, telecommunications workers in the Northeast, to strike 6 times in the last 37 years, for strikes as long as from 2.5 days to 17 weeks, and maybe we can learn some lessons about the challenges and opportunities that will present themselves to trade unionists who are committed to reviving the strike. So let me begin by saying I think the roots of telecommunications workers' willingness and ability to strike begins with a deeply articulated, deeply embedded culture of craft control over the work process. I interviewed about 15 rank-and-file telephone workers who are now leaders and staff of the union for my master's thesis at SLU. They all described a culture of workers' control that literally could be lifted from the pages of David Montgomery's book about workers' control. They talked about how they, on a day-to-day basis, limited output and worked together to oppose the boss in the workplace. Just for an example, telephone company cable splicers described how a proficient worker could splice 700 to 800 cables in a manhole in an hour, but collectively decided to limit their output to 250 to 300 splices in order to ensure that slower workers didn't look bad. My boss, Dennis Traynor, who was hired at the phone company in like 1968, eventually became the vice president, recalled, we didn't want anyone to get in trouble because they couldn't keep up. We didn't want 800 to be the number when the average person can only do 300. We tried to instill in that person that did the 800 that if you keep on doing that, management was just going to say, well, everyone's got to do more and more. So there was this mentality that is built into the telephone workers' daily experience of collectively fighting against the boss. Finally, and I think this is the most challenging reality that we have to consider when we think about reviving the strike, is it's our history of striking and winning that plays a huge part in giving workers the confidence to keep striking. And so this is the most damaging part of what Capital accomplished between 1981 and 2012. For CWA in New York, this history goes back to a 7.5-month strike that took place in 1971. It's a long, complicated story. They were out for 7.5 months. They got $1 a week extra. Seems like they got beat. But by 1974, the big local in New York, in Manhattan, the Bronx, was putting out a button that said 7 more in 74. So there was this sense that was passed down from generation to generation that you could fight and win. The sociologist Alvin Gouldner wrote a book I confess I haven't read it, I found the quote from reading another book, called Wildcat Strike in 1955. I did just order it, but, and he wrote, and I think quite perceptively, a strike is a social phenomenon of enormous complexity, which in its totality is never susceptible to complete description, let alone complete explanation. My hope here is that some of what we in CWA have learned about this complexity can be used by other unions to build on this moment, to spread strike activity, to win strikes and recreate the history and tradition of striking in this country. It will certainly not be easy, but there is an opportunity there, and it's incumbent upon all of us to seize that opportunity and make the most of it if we hope to rebuild a democratic, militant, and progressive labor movement.
Bob Master, former political director of Communication Workers of America, District 1, speaking at How Workers Win, Rebuilding Labor's Power for the 21st Century, a conference held this past spring at CUNY SLU. That's it for today's show. If you have questions or comments, please write to us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for watching.